As I said, welcome to this panel on writing across languages, which is a continuation and a follow-up of a conversation that started at the last Poetry Festival. That conversation was moderated by Willie Palomo, and I felt like it was such an important topic that I wanted to continue it this year. I really appreciate your interest and your presence in this panel. I'm Lisa Bickmore. I'm the Poet Laureate of the state of Utah. This poetry festival was initiated and undertaken first by my predecessor, Paisley Rectal. And then and now, support for the festival comes from the Division of Arts and Museums at the state of Utah, as well as Utah Humanities, and this year, a fellowship from the Academy of American Poets. I want to note that we have the Zoom support of intern Maya Hardy from Southern Utah University, and she is assisting and supporting me as we monitor aspects of the Zoom conversation. The panel is moderated by Kimberly Johnson, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about her, and then I'll turn it over to her to introduce the panelists and begin the conversation. Kimberly Johnson is a poet, translator, and literary critic, and her work has been widely published in places including The New Yorker, Slate, the Iowa Review, PMLA, and Modern Philology. She's recipient of grants and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, Utah Arts Council, and the Mellon Foundation. She holds an MA from the Johns Hopkins Writing Seminars, an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop, and a PhD in Renaissance Literature from the University of California at Berkeley. Kimberly Johnson lives in Salt Lake City, Utah. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to you, Kim, and let you introduce the panel.
Okay, before I begin introducing the panel, Lisa, let me just let you know that I've been texting with Natasha, and she's got a little bit of a password problem in the same way that I think some people earlier did. So I just wanted to alert you to that. I've texted you both. So sorry to make that announcement in this public forum, but possibly we can get the technical stuff worked out sooner than not soon. So welcome everybody to this panel of the Utah Poetry Festival for 2024. It's my honor to serve as the moderator for this panel. We hope to have a lively conversation over the course of the next little while regarding the challenges and the benefits and the affordances and the joys and the sorrows of translating work or working between languages. And so I'm going to begin this session by introducing our panelists, and then we'll have them come off of right now they are, their camera is suppressed and their microphones are suppressed. So as soon as I introduce them, we'll just open up the conversation to a panel discussion. But let me introduce our three panelists today. Stacie Denetsosie is a fiction writer and poet from Kayenta, Arizona, currently residing in northern Utah with her husband. She is a member of the Navajo Nation, and her clans are Bitterwater, born for the Mexican clan. She holds a Master of Fine Arts from the Institute of American Indian Arts and a Master of Arts from Utah State University. Her debut collection, The Missing Morning Star and Other Stories, received a Kirkus Star and was named a 2024 Southwest Book of the Year, and it was longlisted for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize. Michael Sowder is Utah State University Emeritus Professor. He writes about wilderness, fatherhood, yoga, and contemplative spirituality. He is the author of 3 collections of poems and the scholarly study Whitman's Ecstatic Union. The poems of his forthcoming collection, Sacred Letters, Sanskrit, Yoga, and Awakening the Divine, were inspired by the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet. He is currently working on translations of over 900 poems and songs received by his guru, Indira Devi, in visions she had of the 16th century Rajasthani poet saint Mirabai. A longtime yoga and meditation teacher, Michael frequently travels to India, his spiritual home. Otherwise, he lives in Logan, Utah, with his partner, the writer Jennifer Sinor, and their 2 children. So I'd like to just have Michael and Stacie both join the webinar with their cameras and their microphones. Hello to both of you. And then when Natasha's technical issues get worked out, we'll just, I want to make sure that she's actually in the room when we introduce her. So we'll pause the conversation so that we can introduce Natasha when she joins us. So Michael and Stacie, thank you so much for taking time today to be on this panel and to share the wisdom of your creative minds and your experience with us about this topic of working between languages. So I'd like to begin this conversation today by asking each of you to spend a few minutes introducing your own practice and your own encounter with other languages so that we can understand how that experience is framing your approach to the questions that we are addressing together today. So Stacie, can I begin with you?
Sure, yeah. I would say that language kind of influences what I'm writing. I lived in Arizona until I was like 4 years old. And my first language was mainly Navajo, and I was a very fluent speaker. And then I moved up here to northern Utah, and I went to like public school and took ESL classes. But it wasn't until I was taking classes at Utah State University that I had discovered that a lot of my syntax and I guess just language patterns were very reminiscent of Navajo language. So they'd be like, your syntax is interesting. Why is that? And I realized it's because Navajo language is very poetic. We think of language as a living thing. We try only to speak good things. It all coincides with the concept of hajon, which is beauty and balance. And that's kind of the practice that I bring into my own writing. Writing in my short story collection and poems, there are many instances where writing can get really heavy. And I try to be cautious because language is a gift. And understanding my my boundaries. How far can I go? How far can I inquire into like a traumatic past or more difficult situations that have happened intergenerationally. So I'm very dependent on language to help guide me through that and kind of understand it better.
Thank you so much. Michael.
Thank you, Kim, and thanks for moderating our panel. Super fun to be here with Stacie, and so anyway, feel really honored. Gosh, let's see. When I remember when I was in college, one of our textbooks, the foreword to it mentioned that the author was fluent in like 12 languages, and it was like, gosh, when I finish college, I'm going to know at least one other language. And so I minored in Spanish and got pretty fluent in Spanish. And at the same time, I got really interested in yoga and meditation. I was taught by some monks that were sent to the US by a guru in India. And that led me to a lot of interest in Sanskrit because we did a lot of chanting in Sanskrit and mantras are in Sanskrit. And so I was kind of, Sanskrit has kind of like been something I've studied for many years and then formally started studying it about maybe 10 years ago. Anyway, so yeah, I got really intrigued by it's a sacred language and the sounds are considered to be sacred. And so my most recent collection of poems, each poem is inspired by one of the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet. So super fun experience. Instead of like staring at the blank page, I just basically read the dictionary and I turned the page to the next letter and I read all the words under that letter until some word really struck me and a poem came out of it. So it was like a really great project. And so, yeah, I feel really grateful to have had that kind of experience. Thanks.
Wow.
Thank you so much. Natasha joins us. We're so delighted that you're here. Natasha, I've held off on introducing you until you're actually in the room to introduce. And so I will introduce you and then I will ask you the same question that these other two panelists have just been responding to.
Okay.
So, Natasha Saje was born in stateless Munich, Germany. and grew up in New York City and its suburbs. Her books include, most recently, the poetry collection, The Future Will Call You Something Else, a postmodern poetry handbook called Windows and Doors, A Poet Reads Literary Theory, and a memoir, Terroir? I don't speak French, but it's Terroir, Love Out of Place. She teaches in the Vermont College of Fine Arts MFA in writing program, and since her retirement from Westminster College in Salt Lake City, she lives in Washington, D.C., and we're delighted to have you join us today, Natasha. It's wonderful to see your face. Let me ask you, so I've just been having Michael and Stacie respond to this question. I wonder if you could orient our audience today to your own experience with language, either as a reader or writer, or just as a person who is in the world in and between languages. So can you give us a sense of your own language story?
Sure. So I emigrated to the US with my parents when I was 1.5. Is the sound okay?
Yes.
Sound is okay. And I didn't speak English at that point. And I learned English really in kindergarten, although we had a TV, so I heard it. But we had a TV. And when I got to kindergarten, my kindergarten teacher said to my parents that they had to speak English with me. They had very heavy accents. Their English was okay. You know, my mother especially was a good reader and speaker of English, but they both had heavy accents and it wasn't their first language. So my mother, who was a very timid person, said surprisingly to the kindergarten teacher, "That's your job." And my parents continued to speak German with me. And I learned English within months because that's how young brains are so malleable and so absorptive that it didn't take me long until at the age of 7, I started having an accent in German and losing vocabulary words in German. So, English, I always say English colonized my brain. And then I started learning French when I was in 7th grade. I've been reading books by Stanislav Dehaene, who is a neurologist who studies how we learn. And he confirmed my notion that when you're young, learning languages is easy. And it does something to your brain to be bilingual, trilingual, whatever. You have more pathways, more circuits, more ways of thinking. It's just a real advantage. So that's my that's my story. People laugh at my German now. My cousin who teaches German to diplomats said that she would rank me on a scale from 0 to 4. My German is a 2. So, and I don't know what my English is. So it goes fast, but it comes back.
It's a very colonized brain, I suppose, the English.
Yes.
I'm struck listening to each of you talk about your language biography, if you will. I'm struck by the way that there's for lack of a better word, an ethical component to the stories that you've presented. And I'll see if I can kind of tease this out together among the group of you. So Natasha was talking about how there was kind of an externally imposed expectation, a scolding that happened from your kindergarten teacher to your parents. Like that, it was some kind of moral obligation for you to learn to speak the language of your environment. And I'm thinking about that alongside Michael's description of Sanskrit as a sacred language whose sounds are understood or imagined to be themselves sacred. And Stacie's description of Navajo, I was writing notes while you were talking, Stacie, and I believe that you said that one of the imperatives of Navajo language is that you're only to speak good things, right? Did I get that right? And so can we think about the ways that, I don't know, speaking languages becomes a kind of, I don't know if this is too abstract a question, but I'm really interested in the kind of moral valences of the impulse to speak languages in the ways maybe the morality has to do with like participation in a community, or non-participate, like I'm thinking about sacred languages and the way that sacred languages imply like separation from a community. So I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts about that dynamic.
I do. If you,
Yeah, go
or
ahead, Natasha, please.
Michael, I feel like I'm talking too much because I.
Oh, no, not at all.
Yeah.
We just talked. So
Yeah,
you
go ahead, Natasha.
Yeah.
Well, knowing multiple languages means that you can see things from different points of view, and that is moral. I think that's a kind of morality, to be able to be that flexible in your thinking, to realize. I think Joy Graham in her first book, Hybrids and Plants and Ghosts, has a poem about chestnuts, the 3 different words for chestnut. And simply understanding that culture affects language, I think that's a moral standpoint, not to assume that there's only one way of seeing something, or one way to call it, that things are unchangeable and the same no matter what the context.
Yeah, Michael.
I feel that in thinking of a language being sacred, I feel like that you approach it with a lot of humility and a lot of vulnerability. And, you kind of surrender in a way to the language. My interest in Sanskrit came from yoga and the traditions of yoga. And, it's funny, in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, it's famous because of this like 8-fold path of yoga. And one of the elements of that is called Ishvara Pranidhana, which means just surrender everything to the divine. But then in another place in the Yoga Sutra, he says, or you can do this 3-part practice. And one of them is Ishvara Pranidhana. And then he said, or you can just do Ishvara Pranidhana, and then you can attain enlightenment just through surrender. And so, I don't know, it's kind of a yoga teacher I heard one time said, if you want to be a teacher, the first thing you have to do is become zero, and you have to kind of get out of your own way. So I don't know, I feel like approaching sacred language, you have to have a lot of humility is what I would say. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Stacie.
Yeah. Navajo language is so much tied with like creation story and belief and our religion. And so when I say that language is like to only speak good things, I think that was something that was hammered into me by like my grandparents, like don't focus on the negative, like language is this living being that when you speak something into the universe, like you have control of it in that moment. And if you're putting negative things out there, you're calling those things to yourself. There's this concept of sad behajan, which is language is sacred. So just really, I think it helps a lot of Navajo specifically in like their religious belief be more intentional about how they're using their language, how they're honoring like their ancestors, and I guess enjoying the blessings that they have now, because it's also a very meditative practice. Like you need to have such control over your own mind where you don't get caught up in I guess the toils of life.
Thank you so much. So I'm thinking about how the way we're talking about working in different languages right now imagines that there are different demands placed on our minds and possibly on our, I don't know, souls, when we are working in languages other than English. So I would love to have you guys think individually, collectively about the way that that other language, the structures of another language, the priorities of another language influence. This is kind of building off of what Stacie was just saying. How those structures and forms and syntaxes and expectations of another language can shape your work in English when you're working in English? Or if they have. Yeah, Stacie.
Yeah, I can start. For me particularly, I've noticed that there's a lot of focus on land. I am relational to the land. I am just a part of the land. The land itself is its own being. And so I find myself when I'm writing about landscape and what's occurring there. Navajo language is also very verb heavy. So focusing on finding those good verbs is always very useful in English writing, or so I've been told by lots of mentors. There's relatively few nouns, and there are not really a lot of adjectives. So a lot of the verbs provide adjectivical function. So I think that when I'm writing, that very much, I don't know how to explain it other than that's the software that I'm writing from. And it's not always intentional, but sometimes when I read something in English, if I were to read about a landscape, just the priorities of what's written is different than something I would write. And I find that appeals a lot more to my Navajo readers. They're like, oh, wow, you really explained that in a way that I understand it, or in a way that I grew up with, where sometimes I think that English language has to possess, English language has to know, English language makes things rigid, where Navajo isn't necessarily like that. So it can make working with the building blocks of English feel a little more clunky sometimes.
And so, Stacie, would you say that you were describing the verb heavy nature of the Navajo language? Do you think that as a consequence of growing up in that language environment, you have a more, I don't know how to say this, active, that your poetics now move a lot?
I would think so. And it's also just influence within my writing, and I guess my philosophy of writing. Everything occurs in motion. It continues to stay in motion. And I think there's beauty in staying in that motion. I like to think about language as something that's alive, that can't necessarily be captured or corralled.
Thank you. Michael or Natasha, do you have thoughts about this question? About the way that other languages have influenced, I'm just restating for people who might just be joining us, the way that other languages might have influenced your own writing in English.
It's interesting what you're saying, Stacie, because the Sanskrit language is very noun heavy. Very, very much things are stated as nouns, and even verbs are stated as like past participles. And it's really interesting that way. But another thing about Sanskrit that is really interesting is that every word has so many meanings. Like one word can have like 50 different meanings, like just much more fluidity in that kind of way. As a matter of fact, there's a Sanskrit scholar who says every word in Sanskrit means itself, its opposite, the name of a deity, and a position in sexual intercourse. So it's like every word just has so many different meanings. And I think that's kind of opened things up for me as a poet and a writer, and just like, really looking at words and seeing how they can proliferate into different shades of meanings and different kinds of meanings, looking at, both etymology and just trying to find how many, different meanings are embedded in this one word. I think that's something I've learned from Sanskrit. So
nice. Natasha, anything?
I'll take the opposite argument. I love the fact that English has so many words and is this huge basket that allows everything into it. If you look at bilingual dictionaries, the English side is always twice as thick as any other language. And so that flexibility that Michael was talking about of Sanskrit, I believe Hebrew is like that too. I don't think that's very good at all. I love learning every day. I learn, well, not deliberately, but I come across a word in English that I don't know. And I make a deliberate effort to use them in my poetry and in my prose because it's so precise. English, you know, yeah.
Yeah,
I don't
I
myself.
just like to respond that absolutely it makes translating Sanskrit extremely difficult because you're faced with this word that has like 50 meanings. It's like, and so
Right.
different translations of the same text can be very, very different, So it depends on context. You have to learn a lot of history and context and all that sort of thing. But I love that about English too, that it's just so precise and we have so many words. But yeah.
I love that we've got like this, we've got a kind of presiding spirit sitting on Michael's right shoulder at this point, translating into cat, perhaps.
It's one of four cats, and we have a dog, so it's a zoo.
Okay, so this brings up the question, like, what? Okay, so some of you are engaged in the actual work of translation from one text to another, and sometimes you're just translating in like everyday life between ideas, right? And I am wondering if where you all fall on that classic perennial question of the translator, which is, when you are translating, is the imperative to bring over as much of the literal meaning as you can? Or is it rather to give yourself enough poetic license to make a reading experience that is satisfying to a reader who may not have access to the original text? Yeah, Michael.
So I'm translating these poems. Actually, they were songs that came to my guru, who was a poet. She had these visions of this 16th century Indian poet, and over 900 poems came to her and just came out of her mouth fully formed. And her guru was a musician and a poet and wrote them down and wrote down the music. And so we're translating those. And her guru actually did a translation of a bunch of them that were very musical and very much in the same rhythm and rhyme. But one of the other devotees of our guru contacted me and said, these are beautiful translations, but they're often not really very accurate in terms of like what she was actually saying. And so can we get together and do like a more literal translation? So what we're doing is kind of free verse poems that have a kind of poetic rhythm and they have a kind of poetic, we incorporate sound and things like that, but it's a real issue. I mean, Frost said poetry is what gets lost in translation, and so those earlier versions are musical and beautiful, but they're kind of inaccurate, and so I don't know I think every translator has to, I'm new to translation. I think every translator has to kind of make their own, feel their way into it. I think it's pretty intuitive. I think just like learning how to do line breaks, it's just kind of intuitive. I think. I don't know. It's a hard question.
Natasha, yeah.
I hang out with a lot of translators and I read a lot about translation theory, and they say that the life of a translation is 15 years because a language changes that fast. So any idea of fidelity should go out the window. What you're trying to do, or what, in my dabbling in translation, is to make a living thing for 15 years in the target language. I have a great anecdote from Hannah Block when she visited Westminster. She had just translated Yehuda Amachai's poems, and one of them got printed in the New Yorker in English. And Yehuda Amachai was in New York City, and somebody saw her translation, Hannah's translation, and said to him, I love that poem with the rhinoceros, and now I'm forgetting the detail, but it was something like that. I love that poem in the New Yorker with the rhinoceros. And he said, rhinoceros? She had just invented that. She had put it in because it made the poem alive in English. So I think you can add stuff, change stuff. I mean, your goal is to make a new poem in the target language, and any idea of fidelity is hubris, I think.
Stacie, do you have any thoughts about this?
Nope.
Okay, then let me go pivot to an adjacent question. We've been talking about the treatment of texts as we bring texts from one language to another. I'd like to pivot from that into a question that was raised by one of our attendees today. I'll just read it. When choosing a concept from a different language and culture to utilize in English, how do you determine which parts of that culture is important to bring to an English-speaking audience? What deserves translation? So this is, I think, a separate question from that, like, age-old translator's conundrum of how much fidelity or how little fidelity, how much poeticness or how little poeticness is involved in translation. I think that this question is more about, like, what it means to kind of try to make aspects of a culture that may be removed either culturally or temporally from an audience of potential readers and that audience. Like, how does that bridge, that kind of more abstract or ideational bridge, function? How much work has to be done to explain one culture, an origin culture to a target culture? Maybe that's a way to say this.
I would say that's what footnotes are for, right? If you can't do it in the poem, then you have notes that you can append.
Yeah, I think that's really really helpful, and something we're doing as well with our translations using notes. But as far as like the amount of work, I think it takes a ton of work, so that you yourself understand, these concepts you're working with, and they're often very deeply embedded in the culture, and so many. I mean, like, I'm working mostly with spiritual texts, and so many of these texts say, what we're talking about, you can't say it in words. You know what I mean? And so it's like trying to translate words that are talking about something you can't really say in words is something that takes a lot of work to for you to understand it. And I think it's really helpful if you are working with a person who grew up in that culture. If you're not in that culture yourself. I mean, I'm working with two Indian friends, and we work together every week. We meet over Zoom every week, and I mean, I would be completely lost without them. So I think it's a collaboration is a really helpful thing, I think.
And Stacie, this question, I think, connects back to your first comments today, because you were talking about the effects of your having grown up, not just in working in the Navajo language, but absorbing its values. And you said, in your own English language poetry, you're prioritizing the land in a way that feels particular to you. And that strikes me as simultaneously a linguistic phenomenon and a cultural phenomenon. So I wonder if this resonates for you, this conversation.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm thinking in the same vein as you, but I was thinking mainly about the ethics. There's a lot of like Navajo translation going on. There's also a lot of language reclamation efforts happening. And I think it's really interesting because it depends on who you ask in the Diné community. Because I guess a school worked and they put Navajo on Duolingo, and some people were really outraged because they were like, why are you sharing our language? It's sacred with people. Why are you trying to teach it? And so I think that for me, that raises a big ethical question. In different ceremonies, there are songs that are only sung in certain seasons, sung for specific circumstances, and we don't record those or write them down. They're sung and they're to be taught to the next generation medicine people. And so I think that when I'm, I guess, consulting with myself, determining what to bring to an English speaking audience, I would say that I take a lot of authorial custody in making sure that my readers are looking exactly at what I want them to look at, and hoping that those who are in the front of the audience can see exactly what I'm saying, and those might be my Navajo readers. And then maybe those at the back, they might not completely understand, and accepting that I need to be okay with that. Yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, that's so interesting, and it almost flips the the question that we got from the viewer today. What deserves translation? It almost provides us a way of contemplating the opposite side of that question, is what deserves preservation? Like what is it important to not translate, to protect because of a variety of ethical or respectful reasons? Does that, I don't know if that strikes you as correct.
Yeah, that strikes me as correct. That's kind of the way that I saw that question.
Okay, we have a related question from a viewer today. Will Neville Raybane, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, asks, since sacred language holds the power to call things into being, how does that influence your writing process? Does it make writing about certain topics more difficult or more dangerous? Or is there a difference in how you wield language and storytelling versus in your own everyday life? So that's a complex set of questions from Will.
I guess I feel like, when I'm working with Sanskrit, that I feel like I'm in a kind of sacred space. And I feel like it's a different space than when I'm just, writing a poem about my cat or something like that, And so I do feel like that. I do feel like that, again, like I said before, you have to come to it with great humility and vulnerability, and just a sense of reverence. And I mean, there's plenty of Sanskrit poetry that is about mundane things as well, but usually the kind of stuff I'm working with are more like what the questioner, I think, is getting at, that it has this kind of sacred quality that you have to approach with a lot of care, I think. I don't know if that really answers the question, but those are my thoughts. Yeah.
Sure. Stacie, do you have anything?
Yeah, in my culture, there's a lot of taboo topics, particularly like death. We're not supposed to talk about death, or necessarily grieving, because it like calls those spirits to come bother you, apparently. And I know for myself, in writing my first short story collection, that was a really big concern of mine, because I view my short story collection as kind of a grief narrative, and I'm working with a lot of really heavy topics. But I kept returning to this Therese Marie Mahat quote in Hard Berries, and she says, "In my culture, I believe we carry pain until we can reconcile it through ceremony. Pain is not framed like a problem with a solution." And so in that way, I kind of think about writing as a form of ceremony. And with ceremony, there's some element of ritual in there. So how am I coming into a space where I might be dealing with heavy things, or other language, it elicits emotion. When you're writing, when you're translating, when you're doing anything, you're feeling that cerebrally, like you're feeling it through your body, and it's occurring. And if you're not careful, in my opinion, it can get caught there, and it can cause like illness and other things. And so I try to wear like turquoise jewelry, or I try to say a prayer beforehand, or offer corn pollen, to help me through a very active journey, because writing is so, I would say, it's athletic. You're being athletic with your mind when you're doing that sort of stuff.
Natasha, I wonder if you feel anything protective about your parents' German. You're having come from a family where German was was the dominant household language to the consternation of a kindergarten teacher. I'm wondering if you feel a sense of protectiveness about any aspect of either the German language or German culture because of your family relationship with the culture and language.
No, I can't say I'm protective. I do when I watch German TV series or movies. I love remembering how idiom rich the language is and how elegant in its own way. It doesn't have as many words as English, but they're quite ingenious in the way they put them together. An idiom I just heard in this creamy detective TV series that I'd forgotten is du schmierst mir das aufs Brot. You smear it on my bread. And that means it's not like force feeding. It's like you have prepared this so much that it's in my face and I'm not going to have to eat it, but there it is. So anyway, so no, not protective, just enjoying.
Fond.
Yes, yes. And nostalgic for the fact that I have lost a lot of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, Michael.
I just want to add one other thing, and that's just to say that like translation and working with other languages is just super fun. I mean, it's just a really great thing to do. I mean, it's like, I don't know, if you have a dictionary or however you approach the other language, it's just a really fun thing to do. It opens up new possibilities and you make all these discoveries, and it's just, I'd highly recommend it. It's super fun. Yeah.
I do too. It's one of the most fun things in the world. I think it's like crossword puzzles, but you know, lower stakes or something. I would love, in the very few minutes that we have left, I recognize that we're getting right up to time. Could I ask each of you to read something short of your own work that might illuminate your own language practice and maybe reflect a little bit your relationship with across languages? I don't know if anyone's ready to go. Michael, you kind of look like you're ready to go. But you're muted.
Yeah, I had some of the translations we're working on, but I thought I would just read one of the poems that is inspired by one of the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet. This is one of the vowels. The vowel is I, and so I turn to the letter, and then often I say something about a word or two that falls under that letter. So I for Aiden, 12th letter, pronounced like the Y in sky. The letter itself is an interjection, a name of Lord Shiva, auspicious one. I find the word Indra, a name of the goddess Durga, and Indrajala of magic, sorcery, from Indrajala, Indra's net. In the beginning, Indra, chief of gods, spread out the cosmos like a great blue net. In each knot of the net, he sewed a jewel of 10,000 faces. So now every jewel reflects every other. Every being holds all beings. This morning, I'm walking home after rain, my son in my arms. Puddles lie around us like fallen pieces of sky. Aiden holds my gaze, and I remember how, when I was 4, I saw my face inside my mother's eyes. At home, we walk along a porch where windows hold our faces in their hands. In his bedroom, carved animals, coins and crayons, stones and cowrie shells, all our lives fitting the pieces back together.
Thank you. Natasha, do you have one ready for us? Stacie?
Yeah, it's not necessarily translation, but I'll read it. Granddaddy, the glowing man. Peeling an apricot, I remember my granddaddy's hand, his veins glowing a greenish yellow, the color of uranium under his brown skin. My granddaddy, the glowing man. Granddaddy was a miner. He brought home his work, and like any man, he left his clothes at the door. Grandma damned his socks for never going after him. She washed his clothes in the same river that they drank from. The first time I heard uranium contamination was after my grandmother urinated in a cup at the Indian Health Services hospital. I sat in a blue fiberglass chair next to my granddaddy, who came in for trouble breathing. Long after, in their coffin beds, they lie beside each other, glowing hot coals.
Thank you. Thank you all for participating today. There is one more reading this evening, and I think that Lisa is going to rejoin us so that she can prepare us for the rest of the day. Lisa.
I just want to thank you all. I thank Kim for moderating, and Natasha, Stacie, and Michael for joining us today. This was a really beautiful discussion as far as I'm concerned, and I have loads of notes that I'm going to be processing for a while. Our reading this evening is at 7 p.m. and it features Willie Palomo and Shannon Ballum. I hope you'll join us. It's free. You just have to register on the festival schedule website. Thank you, thank you, thank you all who attended, and thank you to our participants.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Kim. Nice to see you, Natasha, Stacie.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
So good to see
Thanks for
everybody's
having
faces.
me. Good to see you, Michael.
Bye. Thank you.